Front end of the war, look, the Ukrainians did brilliantly. That's on the record. I mean, really extraordinary. And they took the initiative going into that first long winter. But for a whole host of reasons that are on the record, not least because the West was a bit slow to really come in behind them, it went into kind of a bit of a stasis. And then the Russians have, to some degree, had the initiative over the period that followed. But the Russians have not been able to exploit that.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Times Zero Frontline. Now, today on day 1295 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're at the DSEI exhibition, a big arms fair at XL in London. And we're very fortunate to be talking to retired Major General Rupert Jones.
Very nice to see you.
Fantastic to have you here. Now, there's a lot going on. We'll talk about the arms fair and we'll talk about the importance of technology and how that's developing. But there's a lot of commentary going on about what's happening in Ukraine at the minute, whether Ukraine is in a position to carry out a counteroffensive against the Russians. The Russians, are they taking decent territory? Are they winning because they're advancing by tens of meters? And can they carry out another counteroffensive? What do you reckon?
Well, I mean, there's a whole lot of activity, isn't there? And the reality is, on the ground, not a whole lot of progress. I mean, to some degree, it's felt quite frozen for a year, 18 months, discussed, how long you feel it's been frozen for. There's an awful lot of activity, but is it adding up to anything? Is it leading to meaningful change on the battlefield? No, not really. And a lot of it feels as though it's about continuing to irritate, to some degree, the other side, keep the other side guessing, and then striking deep, trying to hurt your opposition at a kind of higher level, at a kind of political level, by striking the population, making it hurt for the population.
So in military terms, do you think the Ukrainians have fixed the Russians, or have the Russians fixed the Ukrainians whilst that operational level attack is going on?
I mean, I think they're both a bit fixed, if I'm totally honest. I don't think either side. I mean, the Russia at the front end of the war, look, the Ukrainians did brilliantly. That's on the record. I mean, really extraordinary. And they took the initiative going into that first long winter. But for a whole host of reasons that are on the record, not least because the West was a bit slow to really come in behind them, it went into kind of a bit of a stasis. And then the Russians have, to some degree, had the initiative over the period that followed, but the Russians have not been able to exploit that. And so it slightly feels now as though both sides are fixed on the battlefield. A little bit gain here, a little bit gain there, but it's not adding up to anything. So I don't think either side really has the initiative at the moment. I don't see any big breakthroughs coming on either side.
But the battlefield seems to have changed, and we're at a big technology fair, big arms fair. Drones are everywhere. And when you look at the way, whenever we were in the military, you defined the front line by your direct fire and your immediate indirect fire, where you could have effects with that. Now, the effects that you have are over 15, 20, 25, 30 kilometers because of FPV drones and the technology that's there. Do you think it's that depth of the front line and the lack of ability to concentrate mass in a way that we'd have recognized that has meant that effectively we've got we're either a stalemate or both sides have tactically culminated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, the historical parallel, if one wants one, is from the First World War. With the intervention trench warfare, machine guns, and neither side could kind of have these new weapons that were extremely potent, but neither side could really kind of unlock it. So you got a degree of stalemate. And to some degree, that's what it feels like you've got going on here. So early in the war, the technological advantage, the real innovation lay with the Ukrainians. The Russians aren't stupid. They've caught up technically. And so they're now both using these incredible levels of technology, digitally enabled, AI, and all the buzzwords. But the result is they're basically fixing each other. Now, as we saw in the First World War, at some point, somebody will other conditions will happen and it'll get unlocked. But at the moment, they are both using technology that 5-10 years ago wasn't available to us, and it's kind of fixing each other.
Well, that unlocking, I think, is something that I'm watching the stalemate at the tactical level, but that unlocking, we've got a conflict ranging at the operational level. The General Bodanov from the GUR or the HUR seems to have taken the old Second World War SOE playbook and is playing that out across Russia. We're seeing the development of their long-range cruise missiles, the Flamingo, with a 3,000-kilometer range. That's yet to have an effect. We're seeing the Ukrainians attacking Russia's ability to fund the conflict by attacking their oil infrastructure. And we're seeing the Russians trying that operational level tactic by attacking Ukrainian defense industry, but also attacking the will of the people by energy infrastructure and the civilian population with the massive drone and rocket attacks that seem to be happening almost nightly in Kyiv and other cities. Do you think this is a war that is going to be won or lost at that operational level battle?
I don't think so. I mean, I think ultimately it'll be about a strategic compromise somewhere along the line. We can come on to that in a minute. So it's about the geopolitics of it. But I do think, I absolutely accept your characterisation. So if we're a bit fixed at down on the ground where the soldiers are, in the muddy front line, we're going to move towards another winter shortly. Both sides, as you say, are trying to raise the level of the fight. The Ukrainians doing really well, making Putin pay in depth. Putin calls it special military operation. There's nothing to see here in Russia, and Ukraine are challenging that, and they're doing it very cleverly, very smartly. Real innovation going on. The Russians are then striking in depth in return, which to some degree they've done throughout the war to make the people pay. So that that conversation is going on, because of course what neither side can afford is just that attritional battle where the conversation, the story, the journalists just focus on the suffering, the pain, the sadly the death on the front line. They've got to try and change the conversation. The Ukrainian people, they've been at this a long time now. They've got to believe that their government are still taking the fight to the Russians and making the Russians pay. So I think that's what that conversation is around. I don't see that will change the war decisively, because look, we know the Ukrainian people are incredibly resilient. They've shown that every winter so far. I'm sure they're going to show it again this winter. So I don't think that's going to change the calculus. Equally, in Russia, President Putin, the Russian system is highly resilient. So I think that'll continue to be a really important story, but I don't think that's how the war ends.
So we've done the tactical level, we've done the operational level, and you say that this is going to influence what happens at the strategic level. We saw Trump welcome Putin to Alaska, and Putin seemed to come out of that in the press conference at the end emboldened. And then Putin, when he went to see Xi Jinping in China, seemed to be emboldened. Trump seems to have gone from being emboldened in that, I will stop this within 24 hours, I'll stop this within 100 days, to I don't really know, what's quite difficult. And then we've got the development of the coalition of the willing. Now, we'll talk about Europe and the coalition of the willing in a minute. But do you think that Donald Trump really knows what to do next with Vladimir Putin? Because none of his ideas seem to be working.
The simple answer is no, I don't think he does. I don't think he understands diplomacy. He thinks he can bring his, what he did in business into diplomacy. And funny, I think it's quite complicated. Go back to the First World War onwards. It's about diplomacy. It's really, really complicated. I think he's getting into subjects here he thinks he can simplify. He thinks he can just kind of bluff his way through, and you just can't. And Putin is nobody's idiot. And the person who's coming out of this dialogue best so far continues to seem to be Putin. Trump has nothing to show for his meeting in Alaska. So I really worry about what that's looking like. I think, if anything, the process will have emboldened Russia. They're talking at the moment about, they talked yesterday about, the next phase, the phase 2 of sanctions.
Yeah.
Okay, what does that actually add up to? Because again, that hasn't really led anywhere yet. In part because the current US administration are inconsistent. They don't have the patience. So if they're going to try and make, these other countries who are supplying Russia pay, you've got to do that in a consistent way. And oh, by the way, you better be ready for the US taxpayer to pay a price for that. Again, I don't see the patience for that coming out of the US administration.
Yeah. And how much is this Putin, the wily old KGB officer, using his KGB techniques on Donald Trump and just playing him like a grandmaster?
Hey, look, my view has always been that Putin is no strategist, but he's a hell of a good opportunist.
Yeah.
And he knows he's very resilient, and Trump keeps passing him opportunities. If you pass Putin an opportunity, he will exploit it. And that's what he's doing at the moment. I mean, he must be laughing. As you say, he's then just been to China. He's in a pretty comfortable place at the moment.
Yeah, touching on China briefly, that parade that Xi Jinping put on was impressive in not just the military drill that was there, and I think the Brigade of Guards will be looking at it and going, oh my goodness, right, we'll step it up at the next King's birthday parade. But at the kit that was on display, how concerned should we be about the ascendancy of China?
We should be really concerned. Look, in terms of the kit and the technology and the capability the Chinese have, that horse has long since bolted. The industrial espionage that allowed them to catch up with the West, fifth generation fighters or whatever it might be, that happened a long time ago. We leaked. The industrial espionage happened, and that's a fact of life now. So on the face of it, their capability, their technology is exceptional. Probably the match for most of the things we see here today. The thing we have to hope is two things. Firstly, do the Chinese really want to fight? Is a moot point. At the moment they're making very good headway without fighting. Belt and Road Initiative, industrial imperialism, if you like, that's working very well for them. If they faced into Taiwan and really tried to take Taiwan by force, and first I don't think they need to, but secondly, if they did, I think they'd find it quite hard. In these halls is a vast amount of combat experience that the West have from the various combat we've been involved in the last 20 years. And as well as I do, it's really, really hard. And with the greatest respect to our military colleagues, they continue to cock it up. Why? Because it's really difficult. You might have a huge amount of experience, but it's still really, really hard. The Chinese going on Taiwan, they have the square root of no combat experience. And they will discover no drills, no equipment, no capability will prepare them for the chaos of day one.
Yes, no action survives, or no plan survives the first action. That's in there, and and trying to bring everything together. The Chinese training seems to be very scripted. That's where the Russians went wrong. Their training is very scripted, and when they try to carry out a complex, on paper, their plan for the invasion of Ukraine was very sound, but actually the complexity of it, I think, got one step too far for them, and that's a critical thing that people miss.
I think that's absolutely right. So you remember we used to call about the orchestra of war, and it's a nice analogy because civilians can understand orchestra. They've got violins and trumpets and oboes and all these things, and the conductor brings it all together, and the trumpets are useless without the violins, and so it goes on. And so it is in war. You have to bring together all of the tools, the infantry, the tanks, the artillery, the drones, electronic warfare, cyber, all these things have to be synchronized by a conductor, and that is wickedly difficult to do. We know, because we do our best and we don't always do it as well as we want to. The Russians have done that very, very poorly in Ukraine. And while they've made headway with technology and other things, they have not demonstrated their ability to really bring together that orchestra, and the Chinese would find that very difficult too. Not to say they wouldn't do it and they wouldn't learn, but it is very difficult.
Learning on the job, as the Ukrainians are finding, is very difficult. But bringing that orchestra together and coming back to Ukraine and looking at the political side of things again, we're hearing our politicians in the UK and across Europe talking about this coalition of the willing. And we're hearing talk about, and the Prime Minister's talked about putting a military force on the ground within days of there being some form of ceasefire and everything else. In your past existence, working at sort of the higher levels of bringing all of this together, helping the conductor get his score right and everything else, and your J5 planners who will have been doing this, will they be starting with a blank sheet of paper? Are they producing plans that they're refining all of the time? What's going on to prepare the politicians for what they're promising out in the public domain, and the potential for the reality of what would actually happen on the ground?
Yeah, so look, I have absolutely no inside knowledge at all about the plans, but I'm quite certain that our operational planners will have been thinking about this for a long time. How far are we into the conflict? I've lost track. 3.5,
almost 4 years.
Almost 4 years, isn't it? It's awful how one forgets. So our planners have been thinking about this for a long time, in amongst all the other things that they're doing. But this is a very challenging problem to plan, because what planners like is a set of assumptions. Assumptions about, what will be the conditions on the ground, which other nations are coming, what are my political freedoms going to be? They won't have many of those assumptions to work from. So the planners will be doing their very, very best to work up options, but against a very, very fluid backdrop, which I think takes you back to the grand strategy level. So what is the talk of the coalition of the willing really about? Who is it really for? I would argue that at the moment it is really for a bit of reassurance to President Zelensky, but more importantly, it's to try and demonstrate to President Trump that Europe are serious and they're burden sharing. Do I think that it is credible politically yet? I'd love to be disabused, but no, I don't think it is. I don't think any of the political conditions that would allow that sort of force to operate are anywhere near existing. So, firstly, there's no peace, there's no ceasefire, there's frankly no real pathway to either of those things. And oh, by the way, President Putin has made really clear that he wouldn't tolerate NATO nations on Ukrainian soil in that form. So, that you're such a long way off really beginning to get into the proper nuts and bolts. And even if you get through all of that, okay, which nations are really signing up? What size force do we have? What sort of permissions are they willing to give their troops? There's a vast array of unanswered questions. But to your original question, the planners will still be doing their level best, and they're brilliant at it, of kind of work out, try and prepare the ground. So if suddenly all those strategic conditions come into focus, that they're as ready as they can be. But it'll be really hard for them.
But the planners aren't working in isolation. They're working with the planners from their defence headquarters, the military headquarters in the other countries in the coalition of the willing. And planners, like everything, I was a planner. You come up with a shopping list of what you think you need to do the job. But then how different is it usually when you get into those negotiations that will have happened at your level from you've got that shopping list that carry out the optimal military operation to support anything that comes out, and the reality of what politicians turn around and say, sorry folks, this is what you can have.
Well, I think that's so interesting, isn't it? So firstly, when you write the shopping list, first thing you need to know is what's a dinner am I having? Yeah. So are we going in to peacekeep? Are we, what's the actual role?
Yeah.
You've got to know that first, and that is wholly unclear for entirely understandable reasons. But until you know what the sort of dinner you're going to, you can't really write a credible shopping list. So I suspect they will have a range of shopping lists, ranging from the gold-plated through to the we haven't got much resource and there's not much political will. And there'll be a range of shopping lists that they'll be trying to work to. They will then concurrently be speaking to nations to go, okay, against these different shopping lists, country X, what might you be willing to put into the basket against these different shopping lists? Again, until some of those base levels requirements clarify, they will have an awful lot of different contingencies, I would suspect.
Yeah. Now, we hear in the language, it ranges from peacekeeping. I haven't heard peace enforcement yet, but peacekeeping down to a presence force. It's really easy for the politicians to trip that off their tongue. But from a military perspective, what are we talking about in differences of capability that's needed from peacekeeping down to just having a presence?
I mean, it's slightly terrifying because, of course, a lot of our politicians don't really understand this language. I mean, peace enforcement, absolutely forget it, because you're up against, you're into kind of NATO Article 5 territory if you think you're going to enforce some kind of peace. So first thing, you've got to have some kind of peace. But secondly, I mean, the idea that Russia aren't going to allow our peacekeepers on their side of whatever some kind of delineation line is. So what are they doing? Are they just monitoring the peace? Are they patrolling the peace? Peacekeeping, think back to the 90s when we and other nations did a lot of peacekeeping loosely in the Balkans and elsewhere. It's a pretty invidious position to put your troops into if you don't have the permissions. And the idea you're going to have the right sort of permissions when on the other side of the line are Russians, that's a pretty high stakes game. I've played it a little bit in Syria as part of the global coalition against ISIS when the Russians were on the ground. And you think pretty carefully when you're an aircraft or you're a special forces operator on the other side of a line is a Russian. It feels a different calculus than if it's frankly an Iranian, for sake of argument.
And the front line itself, if we're just looking at the east, we're talking of something that's 650 kilometers plus. Let the audience know from a military perspective how challenging that length of front line is.
Well, I mean, you can just picture that sort of distance and the vast amount of troops the Ukrainians are committing to hold it. If you want to have any kind of basic presence across that front line, you're talking big numbers of troops. I think it's reasonable to assume that the European nations won't be able to generate that many troops just because they don't really exist. There's other commitments. The political will probably isn't there. So that's already forcing you down the route of a pretty light presence. And therefore, are you just monitoring? Are you reporting? And these are all the calculations I'll be trying to work out. But what you're not is able to have any kind of enforcement presence, I don't think.
And the other factor that comes into this, and it all depends in, as you said, whatever the agreement is to get troops on the ground. But is this something that would be a short-term commitment, or is this something that would probably commit NATO nations to potentially decades on the ground?
I fear it's towards the latter. These things tend not to be quick. We see that from the Balkans. We see that from the peacekeeping operations in Africa. We saw that, frankly, with our commitments in the Middle East. So again, we've got to be really clear. What are we trying to do here? Is that the best use of our forces? Again, I think that's a really moot point.
Yeah. But do you think one of the potential plans is actually recognise that the best combat trained troops in Europe now are the Ukrainians, and actually, if there was a pause, to be able to train them up to carry out that peacekeeping capability on their side of the border would then allow there to be a Western presence in country that hopefully would act as a deterrent if you had air support and other things to provide that big stick to stop the bully of Putin coming back.
Yeah.
Would that be a potential solution?
I mean, I think that begins to feel a bit more credible, doesn't it? Where there might be some air support on standby. But again, you're absolutely right. The best people to kind of police the peace, if there is such a thing, is patently the Ukrainians. Do you need some kind of international monitors? Yes, probably. But for me, that's feeling like the lighter end of the spectrum. It doesn't feel to me like a heavy military commitment, not least because we just go back to the politics. I think the language that's coming out, particularly out of London and Paris, again, I may be completely wrong, I have no inside track, feels more about the politics of the conversation between Europe and Washington than it does about credible military capability.
And, to finish, do you think Vladimir Putin actually wants there to be a peace deal? And how long do you think this is going to go on?
I think it's not in Putin's interest to have a peace deal. I think he's doing quite nicely out of this war. No matter what we might tell ourselves, I think he's doing quite nicely out of it. So I don't think it's in his interest to have a peace at the moment. What we failed to do is change the calculus where it starts to be in his interest to have something of a peace or frozen conflict. But again, the idea that you can genuinely negotiate with the Russians and with President Putin in good faith, good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, Rupert, on that note, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today for Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.